In the name of the one holy and indivisible Trinity. Amen. For Christians, Epiphany is the day on which we witness the manifestation of the divine nature of Jesus. At the baptism of Jesus, the heavens open, and Jesus is revealed as the Son of God, in whom God is well pleased. Jesus comes to a deeply troubled world to establish the examples of love of God, and love of neighbor for God's people. As Della told us last Sunday, the manifestation of Jesus arrives just in time. For in the words of Vermont Royster's annual Christmas editorial published in the Wall Street Journal since 1949, so the light came into the world, and the men who lived in darkness were afraid, and they tried to lower a curtain so that man would still believe salvation lay with the leaders. The men of darkness were offended, and they tried to put out the light. In Jesus' time, Herod tried to put out the light. But the three magi, men of goodwill, would not allow it. And so the light overcame the darkness. On January 6th, our country fell into crisis. But as the day progresses, many persons of goodwill gather and remember and speak. They awake to the danger. Through their actions, the light flickered, it grew, and overcame the darkness. It became a moment of national epiphany. In that sudden flash of understanding, many became aware that we stood in danger of losing our nation. For a time, some forgot their inheritance. They had forgotten that our country is the great experiment. Our founding fathers established a society on the basis of respect for laws that guarantee the sanctity of each individual. We have struggled, frequently failed, and continue to fall short of that high national purpose. Yet our nation is the gift of God that exists nowhere else on the world. It has not existed elsewhere in the history of humankind. On January 6th, the day of Epiphany, the nation woke up to the danger. Professor Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School, in a recent video, described the epiphany of a young Chinese professor who was just concluding his Fulbright fellowship in Boston. Christensen asked the professor what he had learned while here that surprised him about the country. The young professor responded immediately, without hesitation, that he had no idea how important the influence of religion was to our democracy. Democracy works, he said, not because the government is organized to control what people do. It works because most people, most of the time, voluntarily choose to follow the law. In their past, most Americans attended a church or synagogue where they were instructed by persons they respect. They followed the rules not because they were accountable to society, but because they were accountable to God. As religion loses its presence in our society, what will become of our democracy? If you take away religion, you can't afford to hire enough police. This morning we are told of the epiphany of young Samuel. Samuel is called to leadership by God at another time of national crisis. It was a time when the word of the Lord was rare. Visions of God were not widespread. Leadership of Israel had failed. The house of Eli has grown evil in the eyes of the Lord. Eli, the high priest, has become a weak leader. Through his time of 40 years in the seat of leadership, he fails to guide his sons, who are desecrating the law of God. He refuses to reprimand them for blatant disregard of lawful behavior. Israel is descending in anarchy as their government transitioned from generations of tribalism. In Eli's day, leadership was the prize to be gained from the tribes fighting with each other for control. How is God to rule if the leader inherits out of tribal conflict rather than being divinely chosen? Sound familiar? The lamp of God has dimmed, but not gone out. God intervenes to establish new leadership and calls upon young Samuel. Samuel is sleeping next to the ark, where the Lord is supposed to be sleeping, to reside, rather. Like many called by God, Samuel is predestined for his role. His birth is God's gift to his mother, Hannah, who was previously barren. In Hannah's song of praise, she raises a national thanksgiving for God's deliverance from the oppression of those who rule only to achieve their own interests. God's call always comes to those who are asleep or in a dream. Often that first call to leadership is rejected out of a sense of unworthiness, but there's no escape. It's all part of God's great plan. That plan is revealed in the words of our psalmist this morning. Lord, you have searched me out and known me. You discern my thoughts from afar, for you yourself created my innermost parts. After struggling in confusion, Samuel finally awakens to God's call after 3 times. His prophecy is to destroy the house of Eli. In the years ahead, Samuel will guide Israel out of the violence of intertribal conflict. Israel will transition to a government based on the laws of God. Samuel will write the laws for Saul's succeeding kingship and then retire in accordance with the law. On January 6th, our nation was revealed in crisis. Leadership had failed. It was also a time when the word of the Lord is rare. Visions of God were not widespread. We are deeply divided and distrustful of our national principles. As with Eli's sons, our national principles are being disregarded. Our laws are not respected, and national symbols are being violated. We refuse to listen to those with opposing views whom we define as evil. As we approach the day of our presidential inauguration, love for our neighbor is nowhere to be found in our national dialogue. Where do we go from here? I find hope in the words of presiding Bishop Curry, who writes in response to the events at our national capital. The bishop reminds us of the national crises we have faced in the past, those that have challenged our national identity. He reminds us of President Lincoln's call to define ourselves as a nation with malice toward none, with charity toward all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. The bishop reminds us of Martin Luther King Jr.'s call, we must choose community. Chaos is not an option. Community is our only hope. Tomorrow we celebrate the gift of the life of Dr. King. Let us honor his life by remembering his commitment to love as the only way forward. He tells us, when I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response that is a little more than emotional bosh. I'm speaking of the force that is the unifying principle of life. We must no longer worship the God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. Reconciliation does not and will not come easily. It takes courage. It requires that we identify and accept the anger that has held us individually apart from others. It calls us to confess this to others, and through that acknowledging and speaking through past differences, we work towards a like exchange. As a modern-day Samuel, we are called to leadership in a time of national crisis. Let us not dismiss the call. Let us not be confused as God calls us. God calls us to rise to accept the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. Let us find courage to accept this call in the words of James Russell Lowell. Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide, in the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil side. Some great cause, God's new Messiah, offering each the bloom of light, parts the goats upon the left hand and the sheep upon the right, and the choice goes by forever twixt that darkness and the light. Amen.